Hi ladies, today we have lesson 7.5, variation functions. Your learning targets are that you can recognize and solve direct and joint variation problems, and you can recognize and solve inverse and combined variation problems. So our mathematical practices strategies says, how can a graph illustrate the relationship between two values? So a graph shows how y changes in relation to x. So if the graph is an upward line, you know that x increases as y increases. What variable must stay the same to create a direct variation? So that constant of variation k needs to stay the same for it to be a direct variation, because if you're multiplying by a different constant of variation, you no longer have a variation because you have a different number. And then what is the first step in solving a proportion? It is cross multiplying. So some of this may be familiar to Algebra 1 when we're talking about proportions and cross multiplying. Our vocabulary here, we have direct variation, which can be expressed in the form of y equals kx. And the constant of variation is that variable k in that equation. You have joint variation, which occurs when one quantity varies directly as the product of two or more other quantities. You have inverse variation, which is when two quantities, x and y, have a product equal to a constant k. And then you have a combined variation, which occurs when one quantity varies directly and or inversely as two or more other quantities. So our first key concept slide is direct variation. So this is y varies directly as x if there is some non-zero constant k such that y equals kx. K is called the constant of variation. So if y equals 3x and x equals 7, then y would equal 21. So it says if you know that y varies directly as x in one set of values, you can use a proportion to find the other set. So you know that y equals kx, or you could have y1 over x1 equals k, y2 equals kx2, so y2 over x2 equals k. Therefore, y1 over x1 equals y2 over x2. So here we have our first example, which is direct variation. If y varies directly as x and y equals 15, when x equals -5, find y when x equals 7. So our proportion we want to use is that y1 over x1 equals y2 over x2. And it doesn't matter what we choose as our x1 or x2, we just need to keep them. So this will be our y1, x1, y2, x2. So y1 would be 15, x1 would be -5, which is equal to y2, which we don't know, over 7. So at this point, you want to cross multiply. So you would get 15 times 7 equals -5 times y2. So you would get 105 equals -5 y2. Divide by -5, and you get y2 equals -21. And that is your answer. So now I'd like you to try number 1 on your own, please. Our next key concept is joint variation. Excuse the misspelling. So for this, it tells you y varies jointly as x and z if there is some non-zero constant k such that y equals kxz. So if y equals 5xz, x equals 6, and z equals -2, then you would substitute those values in and get -60. So again, for your proportions, if you know that y1 equals k times x1 times z1, you know that k is equal to y1 over x1 z1, and y2 is equal to k times x2 z2. You know that k is also equal to y2 over x2 z2. So your proportion is y1 over x1 z1 is equal to y2 over x2 z2. So our second example says, suppose y varies jointly as x and z. Find y when x equals 9 and z equals 2, if y equals 20, when z equals 3, and x equals 5. So again, you want to use that proportion of y1 over x1 z1 equals y2 over x2 z2. And again, we can have y1, x1, z1, y2, z2, x2. So we know that y1, we don't know, over 9 times 2 is equal to y2, which is 20, over 3 times 5. So we have cross multiply. So we have 15y1 equals 360. Divide by 15, and you get y1 equals 24. So I'd like you to try number 2 on your own, please. All right, our next key concept is inverse variation, and this says that y varies inversely as x if there is some non-zero constant k such that xy equals k or y equals k over x. So for example, if xy equals 2 and x equals 6, then y would equal 2 over 6 or 1/3. So your inverse variation here, if a varies inversely as b and a equals 28 when b equals -2, find a when b equals -10. So we have a1 over b2 is equal to a2 over b1 for our inverses. So again, we could have a1, b1, a2, b2. So a1 is 28 over b2, which is -10, equals a2, which we don't know, over -2. So then you would cross multiply. You would get -56 equals -10 a2. Divide by -10, and you would get 5 6/10 equals a2, which is actually 5 3/5. And there you have your answers. Oops. So I'd like you to try number 3 on your own, please. All right, we have a real-world example for number 4. Write and solve an inverse variation. It says the length of a violin string varies inversely as the frequency of its vibrations. A violin string 10 inches long vibrates at a frequency of 512 cycles per second. Find the frequency of an 8-inch violin string. So what we have here is, since it's an inverse, we could have our violin string over our frequency is equal to our second violin string over our first frequency. So we could have 10 over F2, because we don't know our second frequency, equals 8 over 512. So then you would cross multiply, giving you 5,120 equals 8F2. Divide by 8, and you get F2 equals 640. So now I'd like you to try number 4 on your own, please. And our last example is our combined variation. So it says, suppose f varies directly as g and f varies inversely as h. Find g when f equals 18 and h equals -3, if g equals 24, when h equals 2 and f equals 6. So the first thing you want to do is remember from your combined variation that your proportions are equal to each other. So you could have what do we have, fg and h. So f of 1 is equal to kg1 over h1 because you're varying directly in your numerator and inversely in your denominator. Then you would have f2 is equal to kg2 over h2. So then you want to isolate that k. So you would have k equaling f1 h1 over g1. And then in this case, k would equal f2 h2 over g2. So now you can set these equal to each other. So you have f1 h1 over g1 equals f2 h2 over g2. And then you just substitute your values in. So let's see, f1 h1 g1 f2 g2 h2. So f1 is 6 times h1 is 2 over g1 is 24 is equal to f2, which is 18, times h2, which is -3, over g2, which we don't know. So we have 12 over 24 equals -54 over g2, cross multiply, and you would get -1296 equals 12g2, divide by 12, and your g2 is equal to -108. So now I'd like you to try number 5 on your own, and that's it for today. Thank you, ladies.